Thunderhead by Mary O'Hara. Chapter 14. Ken walked slowly along the dry irrigation ditch, with his gun on his shoulder. His mien was sullen. He knew he was going to be late for supper, and he didn't care. Dragging his feet, his eyes on the gravel, he was kicking up, his mouth down at the corners, his cap hanging out of one pocket and his shock of brown hair untidy over his forehead. His appearance announced to anyone within a quarter-mile of him, here is an unhappy boy, in trouble and likely to be in more. Presently he sat down on a rock and laid his gun across his knees. For weeks he had been nursing his grief. In fact, he had done nothing else. Every morning he woke in a dull misery, feeling that something was wrong, but for a few moments not knowing what it was and not quite believing that it was anything real. Then with a shock he would remember the goblin was gone. It was hard to believe. To have lost the goblin was just something that couldn't have happened. Not to him. That was what really got him. Awful things happened to other people, he knew that. You read about them in newspaper. You heard about them, but to him himself, to his family, he felt bewildered and his eyes roved the meadow. If that was the way life really was, that no one was safe, not even you yourself. He raised his gun and shot at a hawk that was sailing low. It veered up sharply. That had been pretty close. He felt like killing something. In his mind, he had cut a groove of ugly thinking. Blame of his father, who kept saying that the colt would come back of its own accord, that he was oriented to the ranch, that animals always returned sooner or later to the places where they were born. That was all very well. Here it was, the end of July. The goblin had been gone when he and Howard had got home from school on June 15th. Besides, with such a valuable animal, destined to make all their fortunes, no chances should have been taken with him. He should have been put out on the range with the other yearlings. That wasn't all. There was his stopwatch, the watch he had spent all that money on. Ken's fingers slipped into the little watch pocket below his belt. That was where he had been accustomed to feel it. Empty now, his fingers explored it futilely. Howard, he might have known Howard would do a thing like that, and so smug, not at all as if he had played a nasty trick, but was just interested in getting information, asking his father last night at supper, "Say, Dad, I want to ask you something." "Well, Howard, you know Ken bought himself a stopwatch before he left Laramie." "Oh, he did?" "Yeah, to measure Goblin's speed, you know, and see if he could be a racehorse." Howard's calm, impersonal tone. Hypocrite, snake in the grass. There was a moment's silence and a funny, sharp look on their father's face. "Well," he asked, "well now, what I mean to know is, if Ken got mad at the watch and threw it away, stood right on top of Castle Rock and pitched it down as hard as he could, so informing his father that Ken had had a tantrum, and if I found it, would it be mine or his?" And the helpless misery that had made him choke furiously as his father turned to him and asked, "Did that happen?" "Sure," Ken had sneered. "He can have it. I don't want it." "But what I want to know," insisted Howard, is it really mine or his?" Their mother had looked very straight at Howard, her eyes narrow and blue. But Howard had insisted, "Whose is it?" And their father had answered harshly, "It's yours, Howard." And so Howard had got not only the watch, but even a sort of title to it. The sun was sinking low. Grudgingly, Ken got to his feet and trudged the rest of the way to the house. He got his chance to kill something just as he arrived. That skunk. His mother had been complaining for days of the smell around the house. Aiming at the skunk as it ambled along the terrace, Ken forgot until the last moment that, behind the skunk, was the house. It made him jerk his arm a little. The bullet missed. hit one of the flat rocks that edged the terrace, ricocheted, and went right through the kitchen window where the family had just sat down to supper. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" shouted Rob McLaughlin, rushing out on the terrace and seizing Ken by the shoulder. "Look at that neat little hole right through the glass." This from Howard, gloating. "Kenny!" An outraged cry from Nell. And a terrible smell all over the front terrace from the skunk. "This is just the last straw," roared his father, taking the gun. "I've had all I can stand of this. You beat it upstairs to your room and stay there. Forget about supper. You won't have any." It had all happened so quickly that he found himself seated on the edge of his little chair, alone in his bedroom, before he had time to think. He didn't care about missing his supper. Didn't want any. What was the use of eating, anyway? As always, when he was shut up or sent to his room, he strained his ears to hear what the other members of the family were doing. They had finished supper. His mother was washing dishes. Howard was helping her. He could hear their voices. What would they do when they had finished supper? Would anyone be thinking of him, shut up there in his room? His lip quivered. His mother, perhaps. She might come up. How would he act if she did? Should he be sad and show her how awful everything was this summer with the goblin gone and no fun? Or should he frown and sulk and stamp his feet around and refuse to say anything? Or should he be reading a book, not caring about anything, and if she seemed sorry for him, just sneer? He heard them all going out of the house and ran to the window. They were going off somewhere in the car, not thinking about him at all. He counted his miseries. First and worst, he had lost the goblin. Second, his father was mad at him. Third, if he wasn't to have a racehorse, he would never be able to give his mother any presents, or take down the barbed wire and put up wooden fences for his father. He stopped struggling with his problems and sat in a stupor. When things had gone wrong, there was usually certain comfort that he could find, indoors from his room and the pictures on the wall, because he could get into the world of the picture and have fun there, and forget his own trouble. Outdoors, there were lots of things, things he called kernels. That meant the very center point of things, like the last tiny egg you find in a Chinese egg when you have peeled off all the outer eggs. You go hunting for that smallest center thing. When you find it, you stop hunting, because this is it. Birds were kernels. You couldn't look away from them. Whatever you were looking at, if a bird came close and stayed there, you would have to look away from the other thing and look at the birds. Birds were it. He thought of Sappho and Sapphire, the pair of bluebirds who had got the name of being regular summer dudes on the Goose Bar Ranch. Last spring they had come again to build in the familiar place where some plaster had fallen out between two stones near the front door. His father had mended the hole with cement during the winter, and the birds perched on the pergola, chattering and not knowing what to do because they had lost the home they built in every year. Seeing the family going in and out the door, they had decided to do the same. So one morning his mother discovered their nest well started on top of Aunt Emily's framed picture over the davenport, and Sappho and Sapphire busy flying in and out over the Dutch door, carrying sticks and straws. And there they had raised their family, because, just to humour them, his father had postponed putting up the screen door, and left the top half of the Dutch door open, day and night. Ken could still feel a faint reminiscent thrill, remembering how he had looked up from a book he was reading to see the bluebirds flashing in and out of the room. That was a kernel. There were other kernels. You could find kernels anywhere. A place could be a kernel. You wouldn't want to live in a place that wasn't a kernel. Here at the ranch, it was a kernel of a place to be, right in the center point of everything. Thinking about kernels did not make him any happier. He mused dully about this. Usually it did. You can only feel the kernels when things are right. When they're wrong, nothing matters. He looked around his room forlornly. Where had it all gone? As grown people return after many years to the scene of their childhood, and wander about in dismay, missing the spell, the enveloping arms, the certainty that here, right here, and not by any possibility anywhere else, is the very core of life. So Ken searched his room and his world, and found a sick emptiness. He sat in silence a long time. Presently he noticed the sound of his alarm clock ticking. That made him think of the stopwatch. He wondered if Howard carried it with him everywhere, or left it in his room. This would be a good time to find out. Ken went into Howard's room and began to look for the watch. He searched bureau and desk drawers, all the pockets of the coats and pants that hung in the closet. He sat down and let his eyes rove around the room, looking for catchy little places, like the inkwell, only it wasn't big enough, or hung on the back of the alarm clock, only it wasn't there. That was a good place enough. Sometimes he might use it himself. He wandered aimlessly around, looking at the pictures on the wall. He liked his own pictures better. And best of all, the picture of the big duck. The Audubon print, his mother called it, on the stair landing. Only, right now, he couldn't like anything. It was like eating food that was all the same, with no taste. He stood before a page of framed text on Howard's wall and read through it. He knew what it was. Howard had it there because it was an heirloom, and Howard was the eldest son and had a right to heirlooms. The word said, "Stop passenger, and here view whatever is amiable, summed up in the character of Mrs. Elizabeth Sultan, wife of Peter Sultan. Her person was delicate, full of grace and dignity, kindled by beauty and enlivened by sense. She was loveliness itself. Yet the beauties of her person were exceeded by those of her mind, adorned and dignified by a happy elegance of thought, refined by virtue. Her manners were easy and engaging, her temper was gentle, serene, and sweet. Her heart was meek, benevolent, and virtuous. She walked in the path of religion, and lived for eternity. Oh, best of wives, and worthy of longest days, she lived esteemed and died lamented on the 1st day of May, 1806, in the 31st year of her age. Go, passenger, reflect upon thine own mortality, and to learn to die." The last words fitted nicely into the way Ken was feeling. The whole put him in a sad and religious mood. He examined the text, an elaborate old English script that was hard to read. He examined the parchment upon which it was written, and the crest at the top of it. He was familiar with the crest, which his mother had on the back of her silver brushes, and a lot of other things. The crest was a tiny dove with an infinitesimal leaf in its beak, and below it a scroll of ribbon, which were the Latin words, Sine Deo Quid. Returning to his own room, Ken drew his chair to the window and sat down to await the return of the family. He would hear the car drive up. Sine Deo Quid, he said to himself. I know what that means. It means, without God, what? He mulled it over. It wasn't really true, not most of the time anyway, because without God there was plenty, most of the time. There was fun and riding the horses and plans and dreams and the other kids and playing with them and sitting at the table with his family and eating and talking and teasing and laughing. The dinner table was a kernel. And the good food, and the way his mother smiled at him, and sometimes his father. So who would say, without God, what? When there were all these good things in the world, he felt a sort of jar inside him because now none of those good things made him happy. He didn't want anything but the goblin. That was it. Without goblin, what? Nothing. He turned in his chair, folded his arms on the back of it, and laid his tousled head on them, sitting silently so while the room grew dark and one star shone out over the pines across the green. Later, when Ken had gone to bed, his father came in and stood at the foot of the bed and talked to him. With Howard, if he can't have what he wants, he just grits his teeth and holds on to himself, and pretty soon he can be philosophical about it. But you, all your life long, If you can't have what you want, you howl. Ken was shocked. I don't howl, Dad. Your way of howling. All this moping around, going around as if you were about to die, looking like a corpse, no eating, breaking your heart, worrying your mother and me. None of us in this life get what we want all the time, Ken. It just doesn't happen. The boy's face quivered. But Goblin, Dad. I know, Goblin. But before that it was Flicka. In a year or two it'll be something else. People go through their lives wanting. But what if they don't get what they want? What then? Ken's absorbed face staring back at his father. The dark blue eyes full of feeling and thought. The light of the candle on the bedside table flickered across his pale cheeks. Here it was again, just what he had been thinking about. Suppose the bad things happened to you yourself instead of the people in the newspaper. Like the goblin really being lost and never coming back. And if Flicka had died instead of getting well. And if all the things you dreamed about and looked forward to would never happen at all. And instead other things happened, awful things, to you, to himself. Kenneth McLaughlin. What then? Repeated McLaughlin peremptorily. He took the brush from the bureau, leaned over the bed and began to restore order to Ken's hair. Well, well, stammered Ken, trying to think hard. It was a big question to answer because, if you didn't get what you wanted, what was the use of living? Well, answer me, demanded his father, putting the brush back on the bureau. Can you take it, or can't you? The boy stared at him. His face was streaked with tears and dirt. His father stamped from the room and came back with a wet-washed cloth and a towel. I said, take it. You've heard that before, haven't you? Yes. Well, what do you think it means? There's many a day you've seen me walking through this house when I've not had what I wanted. Perhaps I've just lost something I had hoped for and counted on, and you don't see me neglecting my duties or forgetting everything I ought to do or making a general nuisance of myself. Here was the real blow. That not even when you were grown up, your own master, stamping around, giving orders to everyone, did you get what you wanted. Within himself he writhed. That thing he had always thought, that he had only to arrive at his 21st birthday and any possibility of misery was over. His father was giving his face a vigorous going over with the washcloth. Ken screwed his eyes shut but held up his face helpfully. Then McLaughlin dried it and flung cloth and towel on the chair. Well, he asked. Neglecting duties, muttered Ken questioningly. You've made a mess of training those 2-year-olds, and you know it. You don't put your mind on it at all. You left the oat bin open and barn door too, while one of them was in the corral and he got at the oats and almost foundered. He isn't over it yet. You're never on time to meals. You aren't clean or tidy. When it's supposed to be your time for work, you're off somewhere moping and I can't find you. He paused for breath. His hard, handsome face, bronzed and clean-cut, lit by the intense cobalt blue eyes, held the boy's gaze. It slid through his mind that his father's face was a colonel. Ken's self-pity died. He longed for his father's regard, longed to understand, really understand all about life and what happened to people, and to be able to take it. Take it, Dad? Why does that really mean, right now, about Goblin? Rob's face became gentler. He sat down on the edge of the bed, with one arm propped on the far side of Ken. A sweetness went through the boy. It was as if he was within his father's arms. Ken, you can't always win. Much more of life is failure than success. And if you can adjust yourself only to success, adjust myself? Rob explained impatiently. That means if you can only be your right self, well-behaved, cheerful, up-and-coming, when you're successful, then you're not safe. You're weak. You can't take it. He stood up, but Ken held him, clutching his hand. Rob stayed a moment longer, his mind seeking some way to clinch the idea for the boy. There was a book I read once, called Fortitude. I've forgotten what was in it, but I've always remembered the quotation it began with. It's not life that matters, it's the courage you bring to it. That means the things that happen to you, good or bad, don't matter. The thing that matters is the fortitude with which you meet them. Ken's face was shining up at his father's. He still clutched his hand. Dad, haven't I got fortitude? There was a long silence before Rob suddenly stooped, pressed his hard lips quickly on the boy's forehead, and answered, That's what I'm waiting for you to prove to me. He loosened his hands and strode to the door. Ken sat up and called excitedly, Dad, I've decided to take it. Rob turned to say, Deciding to do a thing is very different from doing it. Ken was disconcerted. Why? You can decide until hell freezes over and still maybe it won't be done. But if you do it, it's done, isn't it? Yes, but why? If you decide, you can go ahead and do it, can't you? Sometimes not. Things happen, it doesn't come off. You can try and break your heart and still you can fail. With this incomprehensible statement, the door slammed and the boy was alone. It was meant, he decided, as a warning, not to forget, not to let anything get in the way tomorrow when, with the help of his new fortitude, he would begin to take it. Growing pains were beginning already. No such seed as fortitude can be planted in your young heart without pain. In the next room, Nell put her arms on Rob's shoulder and looked into his eyes. What did you tell him? Rob sank into the big chair, drew her up to his knee, and told her. She sat perched sideways, the brush with which she had been brushing her loose hair still in her hand. It's all true, she said thoughtfully. I've often worried, if he hadn't got what he wanted that other time, his first colt, Flicka, and if she hadn't lived and recovered, I wonder how it would have been with him. Rob nodded. That's what I told him, that you can't go through life setting your heart on things with such violence, that if you don't get them, you go all to pieces and won't play any more. Nell nodded. About Flicka, he was just sad and crushed. But this summer about Goblin, he's been ugly. Yes, said Rob, because he's older. That's natural. Nell slowly drew the brush through her tawny hair, so fine and silky that it caught light from anything and followed the brush in a spray of gold. Rob's eyes often devoured her with a sort of hunger for peace, for respite. Now he put his arms around her and drew her against him, and laid his big bullet head on her breast. Here's the wantonest little son of a gun, he said against the blue silk of her robe. Can you beat it? He felt her hand against his cheek. Like who else? After a while, he said slowly, I guess so. In his own room, Ken was lying on his side, looking at the one bright star that shone through his window and thinking about fortitude. Fortitude would be a good thing for a horse to have too. Now, if the goblin came back and proved to be very fast and had fortitude.